Hi, I'm Cassie. Last Tuesday, I was making coffee in my kitchen when FBI agents kicked down what I thought was my front door. Except it wasn't my door. It was my twin sister Rachel's, 3 states away. She'd been living as me for 8 months, racking up federal charges I didn't even know existed. Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering through cryptocurrency. The agents were looking for Cassie Morgan, and they found her. Problem was, the real Cassie Morgan was standing in her pajamas, in Denver, watching it all unfold on the morning news. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, I was the family success story. At 28, I'd built a digital marketing consultancy from nothing, working 16-hour days in a converted garage until I could afford office space downtown. My client roster included 3 Fortune 500 companies, and I'd just signed a contract that would triple my revenue. Rachel, my twin sister, had always been the wild one. Different jobs every few months, different boyfriends just as often, and a talent for showing up at family dinners with dramatic stories about why she needed just a little help to get back on her feet. The thing about being twins is that people expect you to be close. They assume you share everything, understand each other without words, have that mystical connection you see in movies. Rachel and I looked identical. Same auburn hair, same green eyes, same stubborn chin that our dad always said we inherited from his mother. But that's where the similarities ended. I was the planner, the saver, the one who read contracts twice before signing. Rachel was impulse and charm and a smile that could convince anyone to give her one more chance. I should have seen the signs earlier. Maybe I did see them and chose to ignore them because she was my sister, my twin, the other half of a set that everyone had always seen as incomplete without both pieces. The first red flag came in March when she asked to borrow my car for a job interview in Phoenix. She was living in Tucson then, working at some wellness center that sold expensive supplements and promoted healing crystals. The drive was only 2 hours, she said, and her Honda was making that grinding noise again. I said yes because I always said yes to Rachel. I'd been saying yes since we were 16, and she needed me to cover for her when she snuck out to parties. Yes, when she needed $50 for gas money that somehow never got paid back. Yes, when she used my student discount to buy textbooks she never opened. The pattern was so established between us that saying no felt like breaking a fundamental law of physics. She returned my car 3 days later with an empty gas tank and a story about how the interview went amazingly. But they needed to do a second round of background checks before making an offer. The job was in digital marketing, she said, which made me proud. Maybe she was finally taking my advice about finding something stable, something that used her natural charisma in a productive way. What I didn't know was that during those 3 days, Rachel had driven my car to a bank in Phoenix, walked in wearing a business suit I'd never seen before, and opened an account using my social security number and a fake ID with my information. But her photo. She'd practiced my signature for weeks, studying the way I signed contracts and checks, perfecting the slight backward slant I'd developed in college. The account was just the beginning. Over the next month, she applied for credit. Cards in my name, using the Phoenix address she'd apparently been renting under false pretenses. She had my social security number memorized. We'd shared everything growing up, including the responsibility of memorizing important family information when Mom went through her organization phase and made us practice reciting our SSNs and passport numbers. Rachel had always been good with technology, better than I gave her credit for. While I was building websites and managing social media campaigns for legitimate businesses, she was learning a different side of the internet. Cryptocurrency exchanges, anonymous payment platforms, ways to move money that left complicated digital trails designed to confuse rather than clarify. By April, she'd stolen enough of my identity to start what the FBI would later call a sophisticated wire fraud operation. She created a fake version of my consulting business, using my name, my credentials, and my reputation to approach small businesses looking for digital marketing help. The pitch was always the same: pay 50% up front for a comprehensive marketing strategy that would revolutionize their online presence. The businesses paid. Rachel would send them generic marketing plans she'd cobbled together from free templates online, string them along with promises of imminent results, then disappear when they started asking too many questions. But instead of vanishing completely, she'd move on to the next target, always using my name, always building on the reputation I'd spent years creating. I found out about the first complaint in May. A small restaurant owner in Albuquerque called my real office, furious because the marketing consultant he'd hired, Cassie Morgan, had taken his $5,000 payment and then gone radio silent. I tried to explain that I'd never worked with him, never even heard of his restaurant, but he had emails with my name on them, invoices with my business information, and a bank account number that he'd wired his payment to. That night, I called Rachel. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice bright and cheerful like always. I told her about the restaurant owner, about the confusion with someone using my name. She made sympathetic noises, said it sounded like someone was probably running a scam and using my website information to make it look legitimate. She suggested I call the police, maybe warn my existing clients that someone was impersonating me. Her concern sounded so genuine that I almost believed her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, almost. But there was something in her voice, a slight hesitation before she responded, that reminded me of when we were kids and she'd lie about breaking Mom's vase or eating the last piece of cake. Rachel had always been a good liar, but I'd always been good at catching her. The second complaint came a week later, then a third. Each time, the story was the same. A small business owner had hired Cassie Morgan for digital marketing services, paid money up front, received minimal work in return, and then lost contact completely. The amounts were getting larger too. What started as $2,000 or $3,000 contracts had escalated to $10,000, $15,000, even $20,000 for comprehensive marketing packages that promised everything from website redesigns to social media management to search engine optimization. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of the fake emails that had been sent in my name, copies of the invoices that used my business information but had been sent from email addresses I'd never created, bank account numbers that definitely weren't mine. The pattern was becoming clear, but the scope was bigger than I'd imagined. Rachel wasn't just stealing money. She was stealing my entire professional identity, my reputation, my relationships with legitimate clients who were starting to question whether they could trust me. One of my biggest clients called a meeting in June to discuss what they delicately termed consistency concerns. They'd heard rumors, they said, questions about my business practices from other companies in their network. That meeting was the breaking point. I sat in a conference room with people I'd worked with for 3 years, people who'd trusted me with their marketing budgets and their company's public image, and had to defend myself against crimes I didn't even know were being committed. They were professional about it, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. The marketing world is smaller than people think, and reputation is everything. I hired a private investigator that afternoon. David Chen was recommended by a lawyer friend who specialized in business litigation. David was in his 50s, former police detective who'd started his own firm after retiring from the Denver PD. He had the kind of methodical approach I needed, someone who would follow every lead and document every piece of evidence. It took David less than a week to confirm what I already suspected. The trail led directly to Rachel, but the extent of her operation was staggering. She wasn't just running a few small scams. She'd created an entire fake life using my identity, complete with social media profiles, business registrations, even rental agreements for office space in 3 different cities. The Phoenix bank account was just the tip of the iceberg. David found evidence of accounts in Las Vegas, San Antonio, and Portland. all opened using my information. Credit cards with my social security number but shipped to addresses I'd never lived at. Business licenses filed in my name for companies I'd never heard of. She'd even applied for a small business loan from the SBA, claiming to be me, and using my real company's financial information as collateral. But the most disturbing discovery was the tax situation. Rachel had been filing federal tax returns, in my name, claiming income from her fraudulent consulting work, but significantly underreporting the amounts. The IRS was already investigating discrepancies between the income I'd reported on my legitimate returns and the income being reported by businesses who'd paid Cassie Morgan for marketing services. David laid it all out in a comprehensive report that read like a thriller novel. Rachel had stolen my identity so completely that she was essentially living as me in multiple states, running a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and leaving me to deal with the legal and financial consequences. The federal charges weren't theoretical anymore. They were inevitable. I confronted her in July. I drove to Tucson, to the apartment she was supposedly living in while working at the wellness center. The address turned out to be a mail forwarding service in a strip mall. The wellness center had never heard of her. The phone number she'd been giving family was connected to a Google Voice account that could be accessed from anywhere. I found her eventually, through a combination of David's investigative work and my own knowledge of Rachel's habits. She was staying at an extended stay hotel in Scottsdale, paying cash for a room she'd been renting by the week. When I knocked, on the door, she answered wearing clothes I'd never seen before. Expensive clothes that looked like they'd come from department stores I couldn't afford to shop at regularly. Her face went pale when she saw me, but she recovered quickly. That was Rachel's superpower, the ability to adapt to any situation and make it seem like she belonged there. She smiled, hugged me like nothing was wrong, asked what I was doing in Arizona. Her laptop was open on the bed behind her, and I could see email screens with my name in the signature lines. The conversation that followed was surreal. I presented the evidence David had gathered, showed her the fake invoices and bank statements and business registrations. She listened with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for figuring out how to get out of trouble, and then she started talking. Her explanation was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as desperation. She'd been trying to help me, she said, building my brand, expanding my reach to new markets. The money she'd taken was temporary, just to fund the expansion until she could pay me back with interest. She had spreadsheets, she claimed, tracking every penny and every client contact. This was all going to be a surprise, a gift to show me how much bigger my business could be. The lies were so elaborate and delivered, with such conviction that for a moment I almost believed her. Rachel had always been able to rewrite reality when it suited her, and she'd had months to prepare for this conversation. But I'd also had months to document the truth, and David's evidence was irrefutable. I told her I was going to the FBI, that the crimes she'd committed were federal offenses that carried serious prison time, that I had no choice but to report the identity theft and wire fraud to protect myself from prosecution for crimes I hadn't committed. Her demeanor changed. Then, the desperate sister act falling away to reveal something colder underneath. She didn't deny it anymore. Instead, she tried to negotiate. She could make this all go away, she said. Return the money, close the fake accounts, disappear from my life if that's what I wanted. But we were twins, she reminded me. We'd always protected each other. This was just another situation where we needed to stick together against the world. I left without agreeing to anything, but I didn't call the FBI that day either. I drove back to Denver and spent the next week agonizing over what to do. Rachel was my twin sister, the person I'd shared a womb with, grown up with, learned to navigate the world alongside. Despite everything she'd done, despite the months of lies and the federal crimes and the systematic destruction of my professional reputation, she was still family. But she was also a criminal who had stolen my identity, so thoroughly that I was at risk of being prosecuted for her crimes. The IRS investigation was intensifying, And David had warned me that federal agencies don't distinguish between victims and perpetrators when the evidence is complicated. I needed to report the identity theft to establish a clear timeline and protect myself legally. I called the FBI on a Thursday morning in late July. The Denver field office connected me with Agent Sarah Martinez, who specialized in financial crimes and identity theft cases. Agent Martinez listened to my story with the kind of professional patience that suggested she'd heard similar tales before. But when I started detailing the scope of Rachel's operation, her questions became more pointed. The federal investigation began immediately. Agent Martinez explained that identity theft cases involving multiple states and significant financial losses got priority treatment, especially when there was evidence of ongoing criminal activity. They needed to move quickly to prevent Rachel from disappearing entirely or expanding her operation to target more victims. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, document reviews, and legal consultations. I had to provide handwriting, samples to prove that the signatures on various documents weren't mine. Financial experts analyzed my legitimate business records to distinguish them from the fake transactions Rachel had conducted in my name. Digital forensics specialists traced IP addresses and email accounts to build a timeline of her activities. Agent Martinez kept me informed of their progress, but she was clear that the investigation needed to remain confidential. They were building a case not just against Rachel, but potentially against anyone who had helped her or knowingly participated in the fraud. The charges would likely include wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and tax evasion. Crimes that carried sentences measured in decades, not years. While the FBI worked, I tried to rebuild my business and my reputation. Several clients had terminated their contracts during the confusion, and potential new clients were hesitant to work with someone whose name had been associated with fraud allegations. I hired a reputation management company to help address the online reviews and complaints that Rachel's victims had posted about Cassie Morgan, but the internet has a long memory. Rachel called me in September. She was using a different phone number, and her voice had a desperate edge I'd never heard before. She knew about the investigation, she said. People had been asking questions about her in Scottsdale, and she'd seen federal agents at the hotel where she'd been staying. She was scared, and she needed my help. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. She wanted me to call Agent Martinez and tell her that I'd made a mistake, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding between sisters that had gotten blown out of proportion. She could make restitution for any money that had been taken, she said, and we could go back to being family. I told her it was too late for that. The FBI had evidence of federal crimes that went far beyond a family dispute. She'd stolen identities, defrauded businesses, evaded taxes, and laundered money through cryptocurrency accounts. These weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. They were deliberate criminal acts that had consequences I couldn't undo even if I wanted to. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I didn't hear from her again until the morning the FBI raided her house. Except it wasn't her house. It was mine. I woke up on Tuesday morning to my phone buzzing with notifications I didn't understand. Text messages from neighbors asking if I was okay, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and 3 voicemails from my landlord asking urgent questions about federal agents and search warrants. My coffee was still brewing when I turned on the local news and saw my apartment building on the screen. The reporter was standing in front of what looked like a crime scene. Yellow tape, black SUVs with government plates, and agents in FBI windbreakers, carrying boxes out of an apartment that looked exactly like mine. Same brick exterior, same blue door, same decorative planters that I'd bought last spring to make the place feel more like home. For a confused moment, I thought I was having some kind of dissociative episode where I was watching my own life from the outside. Then I realized the apartment number was different. They were rating 4B, not 4A. My neighbor's apartment, the one that had been empty for the past 3 months since Mrs. Henderson moved to assisted living. Except it wasn't empty anymore, and according to the news ticker scrolling across the bottom of the screen, Federal agents had arrested Cassie Morgan on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. I stood in my kitchen wearing the same pajamas I'd slept in, watching myself get arrested on television. The woman they were leading away in handcuffs had my face, my hair, my build. She was wearing clothes I'd never owned, designer jeans and a leather jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But from a distance, she was indistinguishable from me. The realization hit me like cold water. Rachel hadn't just stolen my identity. She'd stolen my life so completely that she was living it 20 feet away from where I slept every night. The apartment she'd been renting wasn't in Phoenix or Scottsdale or any of the other cities Agent Martinez had mentioned during our interviews. It was right next door, close enough that I'd probably heard her moving around through the thin walls without realizing it. My hands were shaking as I called Agent Martinez. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional even though it was barely 7 in the morning. She told me to stay exactly where I was, that agents would be coming to speak with me within the hour, and that I should absolutely not talk to any reporters or neighbors until they arrived. The next hour felt like a year. I sat by my window, watching the organized chaos outside. News vans were arriving, setting up cameras and satellite equipment. Neighbors were gathering in small groups, pointing at the FBI vehicles and whispering to each other. My phone kept ringing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, probably reporters who'd gotten my information from public records. Agent Martinez arrived with 2 other agents I'd never met before. Agent David Kim was young, maybe early 30s, with the kind of intensity that suggested he took his job very seriously. Agent Rebecca Walsh was older, probably late 40s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen everything at least twice. They showed me their badges and asked if they could come inside to talk. The conversation that followed was surreal. Agent Martinez explained that they'd been tracking Rachel for weeks, monitoring her communications and financial transactions, building the case that would put her away for what she estimated would be 15 to 20 years. They'd known she was living in Denver, but they hadn't known she was living in my building. That discovery had complicated their investigation, in ways they were still trying to understand. Rachel had been renting the apartment next door under my name since August. She'd provided my social security number, my credit history, and employment verification documents claiming to work for my consulting company. The security deposit and first month's rent had been paid with a cashier's check drawn from one of the fake accounts she'd opened in Phoenix. My landlord had approved the application without question because Cassie Morgan was a reliable tenant who'd never missed a payment. Agent Kim showed me photographs taken during the raid. Rachel's apartment was set up like a professional office, with multiple computer monitors, filing cabinets full of fake documents, and a wall covered with photos and information about potential fraud targets. She'd been running her criminal enterprise from 20 feet away, probably listening to my phone calls through the thin walls, learning my routines and habits to make her impersonation more convincing. The most disturbing discovery was a notebook filled with details about my daily life: what time I left for work, what I wore to client meetings, which restaurants I ordered takeout from, even which Netflix shows I watched based on the glow of my television visible through my living room window. She'd been studying me like a research project, cataloging everything that made me who I was, so she could replicate it more effectively. Agent Walsh explained that Rachel's operation had expanded far beyond what they'd initially discovered. The fake consulting business was just one piece of a larger criminal network that included cryptocurrency fraud, tax evasion, and what appeared to be money laundering for other criminals. She'd been using my identity to establish credibility in online forums where financial crimes were planned and executed. The financial losses were staggering. Preliminary estimates suggested that Rachel had stolen over $400,000 from businesses and individuals across 8 states. She'd filed fraudulent tax returns claiming refunds of nearly $50,000, and she'd obtained credit in my name totaling more than $100,000. The IRS investigation that had worried me for months was actually focused on transactions that Rachel had conducted while impersonating me. But the worst part was the personal violation. Agent Martinez showed me printouts of emails Rachel had sent to family members, using my name and email address to decline invitations, cancel plans, and generally withdraw from relationships that mattered to me. She'd been systematically isolating me from my support network while building her criminal enterprise, making it harder for me to get help when I finally realized what was happening. My cousin Jennifer had been trying to reach me for weeks about our grandmother's birthday party. She'd sent multiple texts and emails that I'd never received because Rachel had set up forwarding rules to intercept communications sent to my legitimate email addresses. When Jennifer finally called my office directly, she'd been hurt and confused about why I seemed to be avoiding the family celebration. Rachel had declined the invitation using my email account, sending a cold, brief message that claimed I was too busy with work to attend family events. She'd done the same thing with my college friends, my former coworkers, even my dentist's office when they tried to schedule my regular cleaning. She was erasing my personal relationships while destroying my professional reputation. The agents asked me to walk through my apartment with them, identifying anything that might be missing or out of place. At first glance, everything looked normal. My furniture was where I'd left it. My personal belongings were undisturbed. My jewelry and electronics were all accounted for. But as we looked more carefully, I started noticing subtle signs that someone had been inside. Books on my shelves were out of order, not obviously rearranged, but shifted slightly from how I typically organized them. The papers on my desk were neater than I usually kept them, as if someone had been looking through them and then tried to put everything back exactly as they'd found it. My laptop showed recent login activity from times when I knew I'd been out of the apartment. Agent Kim found evidence that Rachel had been copying my mail. She'd apparently figured out how to access the building's mailroom, photographing important documents before returning them to my mailbox so I wouldn't notice they'd been tampered with. She'd use this information to answer security questions when applying for credit cards and loans in my name. The violation felt complete and overwhelming. Rachel hadn't just stolen my identity, she'd invaded my most private spaces, studied my personal habits, and used that intimate knowledge to impersonate me more effectively. She'd been living parallel to my life for months, watching me through the walls while systematically destroying everything I'd worked to build. Agent Walsh explained that the investigation was far from over. Rachel's arrest was just the beginning of a process that would likely take months or even years to fully resolve. They needed to trace every transaction, identify every victim, and recover whatever assets could be found. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was preparing charges that could result in decades of prison time. But building an airtight case required meticulous documentation of every crime. I asked about the other victims, the businesses, and individuals who'd been defrauded by Rachel's fake consulting services. Agent Martinez said they'd identified 47 separate victims across 8 states, with losses ranging from a few $1,000s to more than $30,000. In the case of a small manufacturing company that had paid for a comprehensive digital marketing overhaul, they never received. Each victim would need to be interviewed, their losses documented, their communications with Cassie Morgan analyzed as evidence. Many of them were small business owners who couldn't afford to lose the money they'd paid up front for marketing services. Some had borrowed money or used business credit lines to pay for the supposed marketing packages, putting their companies at risk when the services never materialized. The human cost of Rachel's crimes was becoming clear, and it extended far beyond the financial losses. A family restaurant in New Mexico had closed permanently after paying Rachel $15,000 for a marketing campaign that was supposed to save their struggling business. A startup in Oregon had lost potential investors when the digital marketing strategy they'd paid for never materialized, causing them to miss crucial deadlines for their product launch. Agent Kim showed me victim impact statements that had been collected during the investigation. Business owners describing sleepless nights wondering how they'd pay their employees after losing money to Rachel's fraud. Families who'd invested their savings in marketing services that were supposed to help their small businesses survive the economic challenges of the past few years. Reading those statements was devastating. These weren't faceless corporations that could absorb the losses and move on. They were real people whose lives had been damaged by Rachel's systematic theft of my identity. She'd used my reputation, my professional credentials, and my established business relationships to gain their trust, then taken their money and disappeared. The agents explained that I would need to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, which meant providing detailed statements about my relationship with Rachel, my knowledge of her activities, and my efforts to stop the identity theft once I discovered it. I would likely be called to testify at her trial, and I might need to meet with victims who wanted to understand how their trust had been betrayed. Agent Martinez warned me that the next few months would be difficult. The media attention surrounding Rachel's arrest would likely intensify as more details about her crimes became public. My name would be mentioned in news reports, possibly, in ways that could be confusing or damaging to my reputation. I would need to be careful about what I said publicly and how I responded to inquiries from reporters. She also explained that I would need to take immediate steps to protect myself from ongoing identity theft. Even though Rachel had been arrested, the fake accounts and credit lines she'd established in my name were still active. I would need to freeze my credit reports, change all my passwords, monitor my financial accounts daily, and work with banks and credit card companies to close fraudulent accounts. The process of reclaiming my identity would be almost as complex as the investigation itself. I would need to file reports with multiple agencies, provide documentation proving that I was the real Cassie Morgan, and work with businesses and organizations that had been dealing with Rachel while believing they were dealing with me. Some of these relationships might never be fully repaired. Agent Walsh gave me a thick folder containing contact information for victim services, credit monitoring companies, identity theft recovery specialists, and legal aid organizations that could help me navigate the complex process of restoring my credit and reputation. She recommended that I consider hiring an attorney to protect my interests during the investigation and any subsequent legal proceedings. As the agents prepared to leave, Agent Martinez pulled me aside for a private conversation. She told me that Rachel had been asking to speak with me since her arrest, claiming that she had information that could help resolve the case more quickly. The FBI wasn't recommending that I agree to any contact with Rachel, but the decision was ultimately mine to make. I asked what kind of information Rachel claimed to have. Agent Martinez said she was offering to provide details about other criminals she'd worked with, accounts she'd hidden from investigators, and methods she'd used that might help them solve similar cases. In exchange, she wanted to negotiate a plea agreement that would reduce her potential prison sentence. The idea of talking to Rachel made my stomach turn. I'd spent months discovering the extent of her betrayal, learning how completely she'd violated my trust and invaded my privacy. The thought of sitting across from her while she tried to manipulate the situation to her advantage was almost unbearable. But I also knew that her cooperation might be the only way to identify all the damage she'd caused and help the victims recover their losses. Agent Martinez left me with her business card and instructions to call immediately if I remembered anything else that might be relevant to the investigation or if Rachel tried to contact me through any means. She warned me that federal inmates sometimes found creative ways to communicate with people outside prison, and that I should be suspicious of any unexpected phone calls, letters, or messages from people I didn't know. After the agents left, I sat in my apartment trying to process everything I'd learned. The woman I'd shared a womb with, grown up alongside, trusted despite years of smaller betrayals, had been living next door while systematically destroying my life. She'd been close enough to hear my phone conversations, watch my daily routines, and study my habits while using that information to impersonate me more effectively. I walked to the window and looked out at the apartment building across the street. How many nights had Rachel stood at her window, watching me through mine, planning her next move in the elaborate fraud she was conducting in my name? How many times had we been in the elevator together without me realizing it, separated only by the different floors we were traveling to? The news vans were still outside, and I could see reporters interviewing neighbors about what they'd witnessed during the raid. My phone was still ringing constantly with calls from journalists who wanted my side of the story. I turned off the ringer and unplugged my landline, knowing that the media attention was probably just beginning. I called my office and spoke with my assistant, explaining that I would need to cancel all meetings for the rest of the week. I couldn't concentrate on client work while processing the revelation that my twin sister had been living next door while committing federal crimes in my name. My business would have to wait while I focused on protecting myself and helping the FBI build their case. That evening, I received a call from my mother. She'd seen the news reports about Rachel's arrest and was confused about what was happening. The reporters hadn't been entirely clear about who was the victim and who was the perpetrator, and she was worried that I was in legal trouble. I spent an hour explaining the situation, walking her through the identity theft and fraud that Rachel had been committing for months. My mother's reaction was a mixture of shock, denial, and protective instinct. She couldn't believe that Rachel was capable of such elaborate criminal behavior, but she was also terrified about what this meant for our family's reputation. She asked if there was anything we could do to help Rachel, any way to minimize the consequences she was facing. I told her about the federal charges, the potential prison sentence, and the dozens of victims who had been defrauded. This wasn't a situation where family loyalty could fix the problem or make it go away. Rachel had committed serious crimes that had hurt real people, and she would have to face the consequences of her choices. The conversation with my mother made me realize how difficult the next few months would be for everyone in my family. We would all have to grapple with the reality that Rachel wasn't the person we'd thought she was, that the financial struggles and bad luck she'd complained about for years were actually the result of criminal behavior we'd been unknowingly enabling. I spent the rest of the evening going through my personal belongings more carefully, looking for signs that Rachel had been inside my apartment. I found small inconsistencies everywhere. Jewelry arranged differently than I remembered, books marked with page numbers I hadn't left, even my refrigerator stocked with items I didn't recall buying. The violation felt complete and intimate in a way that was difficult to describe. Rachel hadn't just stolen my identity for financial gain. She'd invaded my most private spaces and studied my personal life with the dedication of a professional stalker. She'd used our twin bond, our shared history, and my trust to facilitate crimes that had destroyed other people's lives. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that I was sleeping 20 feet away from an empty apartment that had been the headquarters of a federal crime spree conducted in my name. The walls that had seemed thin enough to hear normal neighbor sounds had been thin enough for Rachel to monitor my daily routine while planning her next fraudulent scheme. The nightmare was far from over, but at least now I understood its scope. Rachel's arrest was just the beginning of a long process of reclaiming my identity, rebuilding my reputation, and helping the FBI bring justice to the victims of her crimes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new reminders of how completely my trust had been betrayed. But tonight, for the first time in months, I knew exactly where Rachel was and what she was doing. She was in federal custody, facing charges that would likely keep her in prison for decades. The woman who had stolen my life was finally being held accountable for her crimes, and I could begin the difficult process of rebuilding everything she had destroyed. The first letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Rachel's arrest. I was checking my mail before heading to the office when I found an envelope addressed to Cassie Morgan in handwriting I didn't recognize. The return address was from a law firm in Dallas, and the contents made my blood run cold. It was a lawsuit. Mitchell's Custom Cabinetry was suing me for breach of contract, demanding $68,000 in damages for a digital marketing campaign that had allegedly destroyed their business reputation. According to the legal documents, Cassie Morgan had promised to increase their online sales by 300% within 6 months, had been paid $25,000 upfront and had instead launched a social media campaign that resulted in dozens of negative reviews and a damaged brand image. I'd never heard of Mitchell's custom cabinetry. I'd never been to Dallas on business. I'd certainly never launched a social media campaign that intentionally damaged a client's reputation. But the lawsuit included email threads with my name on them, contracts with my digital signature, and invoices from my company's bank account. Rachel had been more thorough than even the FBI had realized. The email exchanges were particularly disturbing because they showed a level of malice I hadn't expected. Rachel hadn't just failed to deliver the marketing services she'd promised. She'd actively worked to harm the business, creating fake negative reviews, posting defamatory content on social media, and even contacting their competitors with false information about Mitchell's business practices. When I called the law firm representing Mitchell's custom cabinetry, the attorney was initially skeptical of my claims that I'd never worked with his client. He'd been dealing with what he assumed was me for 8 months, he said. He had detailed email correspondence, recorded phone calls, and documentation of payments made to bank accounts that were supposedly mine. It took 20 minutes of explaining the identity theft case and providing Agent Martinez's contact information before he began to believe that I might be telling the truth. Even then, he warned me that his client had suffered real financial losses and would continue pursuing legal action until they recovered their money, regardless of whether I was the real perpetrator or just someone caught up in a fraud scheme. That afternoon, I received 2 more legal notices. A restaurant in Seattle was suing for $42,000 after a marketing campaign that had allegedly resulted in a food poisoning scare that was later proven to be fabricated. A retail store in Austin was demanding $36,000 for a website redesign that had crashed their e-commerce platform during their busiest sales period of the year. Each lawsuit included evidence that Rachel had gone beyond simple fraud. She'd actively sabotaged the businesses she was supposed to be helping, creating the kind of deliberate damage that suggested she enjoyed causing chaos as much as she enjoyed stealing money. The pattern was consistent across all 3 cases. Promise dramatic results, collect payment up front, then systematically destroy the client's online presence. I called Agent Martinez immediately. She listened to my description of the lawsuits with the kind of professional concern that suggested this was a complication she'd been expecting. She explained that civil lawsuits were separate from the federal criminal case, and that the businesses suing me had every right to pursue their claims through the courts, even if Rachel was ultimately found guilty of the underlying fraud. The FBI investigation had focused primarily on the identity theft and wire fraud aspects of Rachel's crimes. They'd documented the fake accounts, traced the stolen money, and identified dozens of victims who'd been defrauded. But they hadn't fully explored the extent to which Rachel had actively harmed the businesses she was supposed to be helping. Agent Martinez asked me to forward all the legal documents I'd received, explaining that they might be relevant to the federal case against Rachel. If she'd been deliberately sabotaging businesses rather than simply failing to provide services, that could constitute additional charges like cybercrime, business interference, or even terrorism-related offenses, if the damage was severe enough. She also warned me that more lawsuits were likely coming. The FBI had identified 47 businesses that had paid Rachel for marketing services, but they'd only interviewed about half of them. Many of the victims didn't yet realize that the person they'd been dealing with was a criminal using a stolen identity, and some might be discovering significant business damage that went beyond the money they'd lost. That evening, I met with the attorney Agent Walsh had recommended, Patricia Chen. She specialized in identity theft cases and had experience helping victims navigate the complex legal landscape that emerged when criminals used stolen identities to commit additional crimes. Her office was in downtown Denver, and she had the kind of organized efficiency that suggested she'd dealt with cases like mine before. Patricia explained that I was facing what she called secondary victimization. The businesses suing me were also victims of Rachel's crimes, but they were pursuing legal action against me because I was the person whose identity had been used to defraud them. From their perspective, Cassie Morgan had taken their money and damaged their businesses, and they had no legal obligation to care whether the real Cassie Morgan was innocent. The lawsuits could continue for years, even if Rachel was convicted and sent to prison. Civil courts and criminal courts operated independently, and a criminal conviction didn't automatically resolve civil liability. Each business would have to be convinced individually that I wasn't responsible for the damage they'd suffered. Patricia estimated that I could be facing liability claims totaling more than $500,000 if all of Rachel's victims decided to pursue civil lawsuits. Even if I ultimately won every case, the legal fees alone could bankrupt me. She recommended that I immediately contact my business insurance carrier to see if my professional liability policy would cover identity theft-related claims. The insurance company was less than helpful. My policy covered errors and omissions in my professional services, but it specifically excluded coverage for criminal acts. Since Rachel's behavior constituted criminal fraud, the insurance company argued that they had no obligation to defend me against the resulting lawsuits. They suggested I file a claim with my personal homeowner's insurance instead. My homeowner's insurance was even less sympathetic. Identity theft coverage was available as an add-on endorsement that I'd never purchased, and the standard policy didn't cover business-related losses. They recommended that I contact law enforcement, which I'd already done, or hire an attorney, which I was already doing. Patricia warned me that insurance disputes could take months or years to resolve, and that I would need to defend myself against the lawsuits regardless of whether my insurance ultimately provided coverage. She recommended that I begin documenting everything related to the identity theft case, including my cooperation with law enforcement, my efforts to notify businesses about the fraud, and any financial losses I'd suffered as a result of Rachel's crimes. The documentation process was overwhelming. I needed to prove that I'd never had contact with businesses I'd never heard of, demonstrate that I'd been in different locations when meetings allegedly took place, and provide evidence that the email accounts and phone numbers used to communicate with victims weren't mine. It was like being asked to prove a negative, to document the absence of relationships and activities that had never existed. I spent the next week compiling what Patricia called my alibi file, credit card statements, showing I'd been in Denver when Rachel was supposedly meeting with clients in Dallas, phone records proving that calls had been made from numbers I'd never owned, email headers demonstrating that messages had been sent from IP addresses I'd never used. The technical analysis was more complex than I'd expected. Rachel had been sophisticated in her approach to identity theft, using VPN services to hide her location, spoofing email headers to make messages appear to originate from my legitimate accounts, and even cloning my voice for phone calls using technology I didn't know existed. Agent Kim contacted me with an update on the FBI investigation that made the situation even more complicated. They'd discovered that Rachel had been working with at least 3 other criminals, part of what appeared to be an organized identity theft ring that specialized in targeting small businesses. She wasn't just a solo fraudster who'd gotten carried away. She was part of a professional criminal network. The other criminals had been using similar techniques in different parts of the country, stealing identities from people with established business reputations and using those identities to conduct elaborate fraud schemes. Rachel's use of my identity was just one piece of a larger operation that had defrauded hundreds of businesses across multiple states. This revelation meant that the investigation would take much longer than originally expected. The FBI needed to trace connections between the different criminals, identify all the stolen identities being used, and build cases against each member of the network. Rachel's cooperation with the investigation could be crucial to understanding the full scope of the operation. Agent Martinez called to ask if I would consider meeting with Rachel to encourage her cooperation with the investigation. The federal prosecutor was prepared to offer a reduced sentence in exchange for information about the other criminals and the methods they'd been using. Rachel had been asking to speak with me since her arrest, and her attorney believed that a conversation with me might convince her to accept the plea agreement. The idea of facing Rachel after everything I'd learned was terrifying. I'd discovered that she'd been living next door while destroying my life, that she'd been actively sabotaging businesses rather than simply stealing money, and that she'd been part of an organized criminal network. The sister I'd thought I knew had never really existed, but I also understood that her cooperation might be the only way to help the other victims recover their losses and prevent future crimes. If Rachel could provide information that led to the arrest of her criminal partners, dozens of businesses might get some form of justice for what they'd suffered. Patricia strongly advised against meeting with Rachel without careful preparation and strict limitations. Any conversation would need to be monitored by law enforcement, recorded for legal purposes, and conducted in a secure environment where Rachel couldn't manipulate or intimidate me. I would need to be prepared for her to try to blame me for her situation, to minimize her crimes, or to make emotional appeals based on our family relationship. I agreed to consider the meeting, but first, I wanted to understand more about the businesses that were suing me. Patricia arranged for me to speak with several of the attorneys representing Rachel's victims, hoping that they would be more understanding once they learned about the identity theft case. The conversation with Mitchell's attorney was particularly difficult. His client had been a family business for 3 generations, and the damage to their reputation had forced them to lay off 12 employees. The fake negative reviews Rachel had created were still affecting their online ratings, and potential customers continued to find defamatory content when they searched for the company online. Mitchell's Custom Cabinetry had invested their entire marketing budget for the year in the campaign Rachel had promised to deliver. When the campaign not only failed but actively damaged their business, they'd been forced to take out a loan to pay for crisis management and reputation repair. The lawsuit against me was their attempt to recover money they desperately needed to keep their business operational. Similar stories emerged from the other victims. The Seattle restaurant had lost 40% of their customers after Rachel created fake social media accounts that posted fabricated stories about food poisoning. The Austin retail store had seen their online sales drop to almost zero after Rachel's website redesign included hidden code that redirected customers to competitor sites. Each conversation made it clear that Rachel's crimes had caused far more damage than simple financial theft. She'd deliberately attacked the reputations and livelihoods of small business owners who were already struggling with economic challenges. The malicious nature of her actions suggested a level of cruelty that went beyond ordinary fraud. I began to understand why the FBI was treating this as such a serious case. Rachel hadn't just stolen money. She'd engaged in what amounted to economic terrorism against small businesses. The pattern of deliberate sabotage suggested that she'd enjoyed causing damage as much as she'd enjoyed the financial rewards. Patricia helped me draft responses to the lawsuits that explained my situation without admitting liability. Each response needed to detail the identity theft case, provide evidence that I hadn't committed the alleged acts, and request that the lawsuits be stayed pending the resolution of the criminal case against Rachel. Some of the attorneys were sympathetic to my situation, but others were skeptical. From their perspective, I was just another defendant claiming innocence and trying to blame someone else for my actions. They'd heard similar stories before from people trying to avoid responsibility for their business failures. The media attention surrounding Rachel's arrest began to intensify as more details about her crimes became public. Local news stations ran stories about the identity theft ring and the businesses that had been victimized. My name was mentioned in several reports, sometimes as a victim of identity theft, and sometimes as the person whose identity had been used to commit the crimes. The confusion in the media coverage was reflected in the public's reaction. Some people expressed sympathy for what I'd endured, understanding that I was an innocent victim caught up in my sister's crimes. Others were suspicious, wondering how I could have been unaware of such extensive criminal activity being conducted in my name. The online comments on news articles were particularly brutal. People speculated about whether I'd been involved in Rachel's crimes, whether I was lying about being a victim, or whether I was simply incompetent for not noticing that my identity was being stolen. The anonymity of internet comments brought out the worst assumptions about my situation. I stopped reading the comments after someone posted my home address and suggested that I was probably hiding money from Rachel's crimes. The violation of my privacy, combined with the implied threats, made me realize that the consequences of Rachel's actions would continue long after her criminal case was resolved. Agent Martinez called with another update that complicated the situation further. The FBI had discovered evidence that Rachel had been planning to disappear entirely, using my identity to obtain new identification documents that would have allowed her to start a new life under my name. They'd found passport applications, driver's license renewals, and even college transcripts that had been forged using my personal information. The plan appeared to be systematic identity replacement rather than simple fraud. Rachel hadn't just been using my identity to commit crimes. She'd been preparing to become me permanently. The apartment next door had been a temporary base while she established the documentation and financial resources needed to completely erase her old life and assume mine. This revelation made me understand why she'd been so thorough in studying my personal habits and relationships. She hadn't just been trying to impersonate me convincingly for business purposes. She'd been preparing to literally replace me in every aspect of life. The notebook filled with details about my daily routine wasn't just for fraud. It was a blueprint for becoming me. The psychological impact of this discovery was devastating. Rachel hadn't just betrayed our family relationship or stolen my financial identity. She'd been planning to erase me entirely, to take over my life so completely that the real Cassie Morgan would cease to exist. It was a level of malice and premeditation that I struggled to comprehend. Patricia explained that this evidence would likely result in additional federal charges against Rachel, including conspiracy to commit identity theft and possibly even kidnapping-related offenses if the prosecutors could prove that she'd intended to permanently deprive me of my identity. The potential prison sentence was now being measured in decades rather than years. But it also meant that the civil lawsuits against me were likely to multiply. If Rachel had been using my identity for longer than originally believed, there might be dozens of additional victims who hadn't yet been identified. Each new victim represented a potential lawsuit, a new claim for damages that could take years to resolve. The weight of the situation was becoming unbearable. I was facing financial ruin from legal fees and potential judgments, professional destruction from the damage to my reputation, and emotional devastation from the betrayal by my own sister. The life I'd spent years building was crumbling around me, and there seemed to be no way to stop the cascade of consequences flowing from Rachel's crimes. That night, I sat in my apartment trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. 3 months ago, I'd been a successful business owner with a growing client base and a bright future. Now I was a victim of identity theft facing multiple lawsuits, federal investigation, and the possibility that my twin sister had been planning to erase my entire existence. The apartment felt different now that I knew Rachel had been living next door while planning to replace me. Every sound from the hallway made me wonder if she'd been listening to my conversations, studying my habits, learning everything she needed to know to become me. The walls that had once felt like protection now felt like prison bars, trapping me in a space that had been under surveillance by someone who wanted to steal my life. I realized that I had no choice but to meet with Rachel, despite the emotional cost. The only way to stop the avalanche of legal and financial consequences was to convince her to cooperate fully with the FBI investigation. If she could provide information that led to the arrest of her criminal partners and the recovery of stolen assets, some of the victims might be willing to drop their lawsuits against me. But I also knew that facing Rachel would mean confronting the reality that my twin sister, the person I'd shared my earliest memories with, had viewed me not as family, but as a target. She'd systematically studied my life not out of love or curiosity, but to determine how best to steal everything I'd worked to achieve. The meeting would have to wait until the FBI and federal prosecutors were ready, but I knew it was inevitable. At some point, I would have to sit across from the person who'd tried to erase me and ask her to help repair the damage she'd caused. It would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life, but it might also be my only chance to reclaim my identity and my future. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver was an imposing fortress of gray stone and bulletproof glass, the kind of building designed to remind visitors that justice was serious business. I arrived at 8 in the morning for my meeting with Rachel, my hands trembling despite the mild October weather. Agent Martinez met me at the security checkpoint, her expression carefully neutral as she guided me through metal detectors and multiple layers of clearance. Patricia walked beside me, carrying a thick briefcase filled with legal documents and evidence that we hoped would convince Rachel to cooperate with the federal investigation. She'd spent the previous evening coaching me on what to say and what not to say, warning me that Rachel would likely try to manipulate the conversation to her advantage. The meeting room was sterile and windowless, with concrete walls painted an institutional beige and fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows across the metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs sat on opposite sides of the table, with a Kiai recording device positioned between them and cameras mounted in each corner of the room. Agent Kim and a federal prosecutor named James Rodriguez took seats along the wall, ready to intervene if the conversation went off track. I waited alone for 10 minutes before the door opened and Rachel walked in, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her skin look pale and sickly. The transformation was shocking. My vibrant, charismatic sister had been replaced by someone who looked hollowed out and desperate. Her hair was limp and unwashed, her eyes had dark circles beneath them, and she'd lost enough weight that the jumpsuit hung loose on her frame. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other across the metal table, twins who shared the same face but had become strangers in every way that mattered. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table toward me, but I pulled my hands back before she could touch them. Her first words were exactly what Patricia had predicted. She claimed that everything had spiraled out of control, that she'd never intended for things to go as far as they had, and that she'd been trying to find a way to fix the situation when the FBI arrested her. She looked directly into my eyes as she spoke, using the same earnest expression that had convinced me to cover for her countless times when we were growing up. I listened without responding while she explained her version of events. According to Rachel, she'd only used my identity initially to get a business loan when her own credit was too damaged to qualify. The consulting business had started as a legitimate attempt to make money and pay me back, but she'd gotten in over her head when clients demanded more than she could deliver. The sabotage of businesses, she claimed, had been the idea of her criminal partners. They'd convinced her that destroying evidence of failed marketing campaigns would protect everyone from lawsuits and give them time to return the money they'd stolen. She portrayed herself as a naive victim who'd been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals. Every word she spoke was carefully calculated to minimize her responsibility and maximize my sympathy. She reminded me of our childhood bond, our shared experiences growing up as twins, and the promise we'd made to always protect each other. She cried as she talked about how scared she was of going to prison, how sorry she was for the damage she'd caused, and how much she needed my help to get through this nightmare. Patricia had warned me that Rachel would try to rewrite history to make herself seem like a victim rather than a perpetrator. But hearing her do it in person was still infuriating. She was sitting in federal custody facing decades in prison for crimes that had destroyed dozens of businesses and nearly ruined my life. Yet she was still trying to manipulate me into feeling sorry for her. When she finished her rehearsed apology, I pulled out the folder Patricia had prepared and began reading from it. The folder contained documentation of every crime Rachel had committed, every business she'd damaged, and every life she'd disrupted. I read the names of her victims aloud, describing the real consequences of her actions in detail. Mitchell's custom cabinetry had been forced to close permanently after losing 12 employees and most of their customer base. The family that had run the business for 3 generations was now facing bankruptcy and had lost their home to foreclosure. 3 other businesses had closed entirely, putting 47 people out of work during an already difficult economic period. Rachel's face changed as I read through the victim impact statements. The tears stopped, and her expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. She interrupted me to claim that I was being dramatic, that businesses failed all the time, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and that I was being unfair by blaming her for economic problems that were bigger than any individual marketing campaign. Her response revealed the truth that I'd been trying to deny. Rachel wasn't sorry for what she'd done to her victims. She was only sorry that she'd been caught. The tears and apologies had been performance art designed to manipulate me into helping her escape the consequences of her actions. I asked her directly about the notebook they'd found in her apartment, the one filled with details about my daily routine and personal habits. She claimed it had been research for helping my business, that she'd been trying to understand my methods so she could emulate my success. When I asked why she'd been living next door to me under my name, she said she'd wanted to be close to family during a difficult time in her life. Every explanation was plausible on the surface, but felt hollow when examined closely. Agent Martinez had shown me evidence that Rachel had been planning to obtain new identification documents in my name to literally replace me and start a new life using my identity. There was no innocent explanation for that level of premeditation. James Rodriguez, the federal prosecutor, finally interrupted the conversation to explain what the government was prepared to offer in exchange for Rachel's cooperation. They wanted information about her criminal partners, details about the methods they'd used to steal identities and defraud businesses, and help recovering assets that could be returned to victims. In exchange, they were willing to recommend a reduced sentence that would allow Rachel to be eligible for parole in 12 years, instead of the 25 to 30 years she was facing if convicted at trial. She would also have to make full restitution to her victims, which meant liquidating any assets she'd hidden and working to pay back the money she'd stolen. Rachel listened to the offer with the calculating expression I remembered from childhood. When she'd weigh the potential consequences of different lies, she could tell to get out of trouble. She asked questions about the specifics of the plea agreement, the conditions of her potential incarceration, and the timeline for providing the information prosecutors wanted. But she also kept looking at me, clearly hoping that I would advocate for her or express support for her accepting the deal. She seemed to believe that our family connection still carried weight, that I would put our relationship ahead of justice for her victims. I told her directly that she needed to take responsibility for what she'd done, not just to reduce her own sentence, but because it was the right thing to do. Dozens of innocent business owners were still suffering because of her crimes, and some of them might never recover from the financial damage she'd caused. Her response was cold and calculating. She pointed out that cooperating with the federal investigation would make her a target for retaliation from her criminal partners, some of whom were still at large. She claimed that providing information could put her life in danger, both in prison and after her eventual release. She also reminded me that several businesses were still suing me for damages related to her crimes. If she accepted the plea agreement and admitted guilt, those lawsuits might be easier to resolve. But there was no guarantee that the victims would drop their claims against me. She suggested that my cooperation in convincing her to accept the deal should come with some assurance that I would be protected from continued legal action. Rodriguez explained that the civil lawsuits were separate from the criminal case and that the federal government couldn't force victims to drop their claims against me. However, he believed that many of the lawsuits would be dismissed once there was a criminal conviction establishing that Rachel had committed the underlying fraud. The conversation continued for almost 3 hours, with Rachel alternating between emotional appeals and cold negotiations. She would cry about how scared she was, then immediately start bargaining for better terms in her plea agreement. She would apologize for the pain she'd caused me, then suggest that I was partly responsible for not noticing her crimes sooner. Patricia finally called for a break when it became clear that Rachel was trying to wear me down emotionally rather than genuinely considering the prosecutor's offer. We stepped into the hallway, where Agent Martinez warned me that manipulative behavior was common among criminals facing serious charges, and that I shouldn't feel guilty for not being able to reach Rachel on an emotional level. When we returned to the meeting room, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of appealing to Rachel's conscience or trying to make her understand the harm she'd caused, I focused on the practical reality of her situation. She was facing decades in prison whether she cooperated or not, but cooperation would at least allow her to have some control over her fate. I also told her that I would be testifying against her at trial if she didn't accept the plea agreement. The federal prosecutors had enough evidence to convict her without her cooperation, and my testimony about the identity theft and its impact on my life would be compelling to a jury. For the first time during our conversation, Rachel seemed to understand that she had no leverage left. Her criminal partners had already been arrested based on evidence the FBI had gathered independently. The victims of her crimes were already pursuing civil lawsuits regardless of whether she cooperated, and her own family was no longer willing to enable her behavior or protect her from consequences. She asked to speak with her attorney privately before making a decision about the plea agreement. Agent Martinez escorted me out of the meeting room while Rachel consulted with her legal counsel about the terms being offered. I waited in a nearby conference room for almost an hour before Rodriguez came to tell me that Rachel had decided to accept the plea agreement. She would provide full cooperation with the federal investigation, including testimony against her criminal partners and assistance in tracing hidden assets that could be returned to victims. The plea agreement would require Rachel to serve a minimum of 12 years in federal prison, with the possibility of additional time if she failed to cooperate fully with investigators. She would also be required to make restitution to all identified victims, which would likely take decades given the amount of money she'd stolen. Rodriguez explained that my testimony would still be needed for the cases against Rachel's criminal partners, but that I wouldn't have to face another confrontation with Rachel herself unless she violated the terms of her plea agreement. The formal sentencing hearing would take place in 6 weeks, and I would have the opportunity to provide a victim impact statement if I chose to do so. As I left the federal courthouse that afternoon, I felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. Rachel's cooperation would help the FBI build cases against the other criminals and might lead to asset recovery that could help her victims. But it also meant accepting that my twin sister was gone forever, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and couldn't save. The next few weeks brought a flurry of legal activity as Rachel began cooperating with federal investigators. Agent Martinez called me regularly with updates about new arrests, asset seizures, and evidence that was being gathered against the criminal network Rachel had been part of. The scope of the operation was larger than anyone had initially realized. Rachel's group had been active in 16 states, using dozens of stolen identities to defraud hundreds of businesses. The total losses were estimated at more than $3 million, making it one of the largest identity theft cases the FBI had investigated in recent years. Rachel's information led to the arrest of 5 additional suspects, including the man who had trained her to use cryptocurrency for money laundering and the woman who had created the fake identification documents she'd used. Each arrest led to the discovery of additional victims and evidence of even more sophisticated criminal techniques. But the most significant breakthrough came when investigators found a storage unit that Rachel had rented using yet another stolen identity. Inside were boxes of documentation related to hundreds of potential identity theft targets, including detailed files on dozens of people whose identities hadn't yet been stolen. The files contained the kind of personal information that would allow sophisticated identity theft, social security numbers, bank account information, employment records, and even personal details about daily routines and family relationships. Many of the potential victims were small business owners with good credit and established professional reputations, exactly the kind of targets that Rachel's group preferred. Agent Kim called to tell me that my file had been among those found in the storage unit. Rachel had been collecting information about me for more than 2 years before she began actively using my identity, suggesting that the decision to target me had been premeditated rather than opportunistic. The file contained copies of my tax returns, bank statements, business contracts, and even photographs taken outside my apartment building. There were detailed notes about my work schedule, my client relationships, and my personal habits. The level of surveillance was far more extensive than I'd imagined. But the file also contained information about other family members, including our parents and several cousins who had successful careers. Rachel hadn't just been planning to steal my identity. She'd been preparing to target our entire family if her initial crimes had been successful. This revelation made me understand that Rachel's betrayal wasn't personal in the way I'd thought. She hadn't targeted me because of sibling rivalry or family resentment. She'd targeted me because I fit the profile of her preferred victims. Successful, trusting, and unlikely to notice subtle signs of identity theft until significant damage had been done. The discovery of the storage unit led to a new round of charges against Rachel and her criminal partners. Federal prosecutors added conspiracy charges, racketeering violations, and additional counts of identity theft for each potential victim, whose information had been collected. Patricia explained that these additional charges strengthened my position in the civil lawsuits I was facing. The evidence of premeditation and the scale of the criminal enterprise made it clear that I had been a victim rather than a participant in Rachel's crimes. Several of the businesses that had been suing me began dropping their claims after their attorneys reviewed the federal evidence. Mitchell's Custom Cabinetry was among the first to dismiss their lawsuit, with their attorney acknowledging that it was clear I had been victimized by the same criminal enterprise that had targeted his client. But other lawsuits continued, with some attorneys arguing that their clients deserved compensation regardless of whether I had been personally involved in the crimes committed in my name. These cases would likely take years to resolve, even with the criminal conviction that was now guaranteed by Rachel's plea agreement. The media attention surrounding the case intensified as more details became public. Local and national news outlets ran stories about the sophisticated identity theft ring and the extensive damage it had caused to small businesses across multiple states. I was interviewed by several reporters who wanted to understand how identity theft could go undetected for so long and what victims could do to protect themselves. The conversations were difficult because they required me to relive the betrayal and violation I'd experienced, but I felt obligated to help other people understand the warning signs I'd missed. The interviews also helped me process what had happened and begin thinking about how to rebuild my life and my business. The identity theft had destroyed much of the professional reputation I'd spent years building, but it had also given me expertise in an area that few people understood. Patricia suggested that I consider specializing in helping other identity theft victims navigate the complex legal and financial challenges they faced. My experience with both the criminal and civil aspects of identity theft would be valuable to people who found themselves in similar situations. The idea of turning my nightmare into something that could help others was appealing, but I wasn't ready to make major career decisions while still dealing with the ongoing legal consequences of Rachel's crimes. I needed to focus on resolving the remaining lawsuits and working with federal investigators to ensure that Rachel's criminal partners were successfully prosecuted. Agent Martinez called with news that the final member of Rachel's criminal network had been arrested in Miami. Carlos Vega had been the leader of the group, the person who had recruited Rachel and trained her in the sophisticated identity theft techniques she'd used. Vega's arrest completed the federal case against the entire criminal network, but it also revealed additional victims who hadn't yet been identified. Rachel's cooperation had been crucial in understanding the full scope of the operation and locating evidence that led to the other arrests. The success of the federal investigation was satisfying from a justice perspective, but it didn't undo the damage that had been done to my life and the lives of Rachel's other victims. Dozens of small businesses had been destroyed or severely damaged, hundreds of jobs had been lost, and families had been devastated by the financial losses they'd suffered. Rachel's sentencing hearing was scheduled for December, and I was preparing my victim impact statement. Patricia advised me to focus on the personal and professional damage I'd suffered, rather than trying to express anger or seek additional punishment. The statement was one of the most difficult things I'd ever written. How do you explain to a judge the experience of discovering that your twin sister had been living next door while systematically destroying your life? How do you quantify the emotional damage of learning that someone you loved had viewed you as nothing more than a target for financial exploitation? I wrote about the violation of privacy I'd experienced, the professional damage to my business, and the ongoing stress of facing multiple lawsuits for crimes I hadn't committed. I also wrote about the broader impact on Rachel's other victims, the small business owners whose livelihoods had been destroyed by her deliberate sabotage. But I also wrote about forgiveness, not because Rachel deserved it, but because carrying anger and resentment would only cause me additional suffering. I had to find a way to move forward with my life. And that required letting go of the fantasy that Rachel would ever acknowledge the full extent of the harm she'd caused. The night before the sentencing hearing, I sat in my apartment thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 6 months ago, I'd been focused on growing my business and building relationships with clients who trusted my expertise. Now I was preparing to watch my twin sister be sentenced to more than a decade in federal prison for crimes that had nearly destroyed my life. The apartment still felt strange, knowing that Rachel had been living next door while planning to replace me entirely. I'd considered moving, but I didn't want to let her crimes force me out of a home I'd chosen and made my own. Instead, I'd reclaimed the space by changing everything I could control. New furniture, different routines, additional security measures that helped me feel safe. The physical changes were symbolic of the deeper transformation I was going through as I rebuilt my identity and my life. Tomorrow would bring closure to the criminal case against Rachel, but it would also mark the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I had survived something that could have destroyed me completely, and I was determined to use that survival to build something stronger and more meaningful than what I'd lost. The courtroom was packed on the morning of Rachel's sentencing. I arrived early and took a seat in the second row, close enough to see everything but far enough back to avoid unwanted attention from the media representatives scattered throughout the gallery. Agent Martinez nodded to me from across the aisle, while Patricia sat beside me with a folder containing my victim impact statement. Judge Catherine Wells entered at exactly 9 o'clock, her black robes flowing as she took her position behind the bench. She was in her 60s with silver hair, and the kind of commanding presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. This was clearly a judge who had seen every type of criminal case and wasn't easily impressed by sob stories or manipulation. Rachel was brought in wearing a navy blue suit that her attorney had probably chosen to make her look more sympathetic. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost in custody and had clearly spent time preparing for this appearance. Her hair was styled, her makeup was carefully applied, and she carried herself with something approaching confidence. But I could see the fear in her eyes as she scanned the courtroom. The gallery was filled with some of her victims, business owners who had traveled from across the country to see justice served. Their faces showed a mixture of anger, exhaustion, and desperate hope that this sentencing might provide some measure of closure for the devastating losses they'd suffered. Federal prosecutor James Rodriguez began by outlining the scope of Rachel's crimes and their impact on victims. He described the systematic nature of her identity theft operation, the deliberate sabotage of small businesses, and the sophisticated money laundering techniques she'd used to hide her profits. His presentation was methodical and devastating, building a picture of criminal behavior that had been both premeditated and malicious. Rodriguez called 3 victims to provide testimony about the impact of Rachel's crimes. The first was Robert Mitchell, whose family cabinetry business had been destroyed by Rachel's deliberate sabotage campaign. He spoke in a quiet voice about laying off employees who had worked for his family for decades, about losing the building his grandfather had purchased in 1952, about watching 3 generations of craftsmanship reputation crumble because of fake online reviews and manufactured scandals. The second victim was Maria Santos, whose Seattle restaurant had never recovered from the food poisoning scare that Rachel had fabricated. Maria described the health department investigations, the lost customers, and the crushing debt that had forced her to close the restaurant where she'd invested her life savings and her dreams of providing for her children's education. The third victim was David Chen, a small business consultant whose identity had also been stolen by Rachel's criminal network. Unlike my situation, David hadn't discovered the theft until after his credit was ruined and his professional reputation was destroyed. He'd lost his home, his business, and his marriage before federal investigators confirmed that he'd been victimized by the same criminals who had targeted me. Each testimony was heartbreaking and infuriating. These weren't wealthy corporations that could absorb losses and move on. They were ordinary people whose lives had been shattered by Rachel's calculated cruelty. The human cost of her crimes was far greater than the financial losses, which were already staggering. Rachel's defense attorney, Michael Harrison, attempted to present mitigation evidence that portrayed her as a troubled individual who had made poor choices but deserved mercy. He described her childhood struggles with our parents' divorce, her history of depression and anxiety, and her claims that she had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. Harrison argued that Rachel's cooperation with federal investigators demonstrated genuine remorse and a commitment to making amends for her actions. He pointed to the arrests of her criminal partners and the recovery of assets that would benefit victims as evidence that she deserved credit for helping to bring the entire network to justice. But Judge Wells seemed unimpressed by the mitigation arguments. She interrupted Harrison several times to ask pointed questions about the premeditation evident in Rachel's crimes, the extensive surveillance she had conducted of potential victims, and the deliberate nature of the business sabotage she had orchestrated. When Harrison claimed that Rachel had been a minor player in the criminal enterprise, Judge Wells referenced evidence showing that Rachel had recruited new victims, trained other criminals in identity theft techniques, and personally profited from hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen funds. The judge's questions made it clear that she viewed Rachel as a sophisticated criminal rather than a misguided victim. Then it was time for victim impact statements. Judge Wells called my name first, and I walked to the podium with hands that trembled despite weeks of preparation. I looked directly at Rachel as I began speaking, wanting her to see the real consequences of her actions rather than the sanitized version her attorney had presented. I described the violation of learning that my twin sister had been living next door while destroying my life, the professional damage that continued to affect my business relationships, and the ongoing stress of defending myself against lawsuits for crimes I hadn't committed. I talked about the nights I'd lain awake wondering what other aspects of my identity had been compromised, the paranoia that had infected every interaction with new clients or business partners. But I also spoke about the other victims whose lives had been devastated by Rachel's crimes. I read excerpts from letters I'd received from business owners who had lost everything, families who had been forced into bankruptcy, employees who had lost jobs when their employers couldn't survive the financial losses Rachel had caused. I told Judge Wells that while I would eventually recover from the damage Rachel had done to my life, many of her victims would never fully rebuild what they had lost. Small businesses that had been passed down through generations were gone forever. Dreams that had taken lifetimes to build had been destroyed in months by Rachel's systematic sabotage. Finally, I looked directly at Rachel and told her that I forgave her, not because she had earned forgiveness, but because carrying hatred would only cause me additional suffering. I said that I hoped she would use her time in prison to understand the real impact of her actions and find a way to contribute positively to society when she was eventually released. Rachel wiped tears from her eyes as I spoke. but I couldn't tell whether they were genuine remorse or calculated performance art, designed to influence the judge. After months of manipulation and lies, I no longer trusted anything about her emotional expressions. When I returned to my seat, Judge Wells called Rachel to stand for sentencing. Rachel rose slowly, her hands clasped behind her back as she faced the judge who would determine how many years of her life she would spend in federal prison. Judge Wells began by acknowledging Rachel's cooperation with federal investigators and the assistance she had provided in dismantling the criminal network she had been part of. The judge noted that Rachel's information had led to multiple arrests and the recovery of assets that would benefit victims, factors that weighed in favor of the reduced sentence outlined in her plea agreement. But Judge Wells also emphasized the serious nature of Rachel's crimes and their devastating impact on victims. The judge described the premeditation evident in Rachel's surveillance activities, the sophistication of her money laundering techniques, and the callous indifference she had shown toward the small business owners whose lives she had destroyed. Judge Wells sentenced Rachel to 14 years in federal prison, 2 years more than the minimum required by her plea agreement. The judge explained that the additional time reflected the extensive planning involved in Rachel's crimes and the particular cruelty of targeting small businesses during an already challenging economic period. Rachel would be eligible for parole after serving 12 years, but only if she continued to cooperate fully with federal investigators and made substantial progress toward paying restitution to her victims. Judge Wells emphasized that any violation of the cooperation agreement would result in additional charges and a much longer sentence. The restitution order was equally significant. Rachel was required to pay back every dollar she had stolen, plus interest and penalties that brought the total to more than $2 million. She would have to liquidate all assets, including property and investments purchased with stolen funds, and dedicate any future earnings to victim compensation until the debt was fully satisfied. Judge Wells also imposed strict conditions on Rachel's eventual supervised release. She would be prohibited from using computers or internet access without approval from probation officers, banned from opening financial accounts without supervision, and required to submit to regular financial monitoring for the rest of her life. As the judge read the sentence, Rachel stood perfectly still with her head bowed. She didn't react when the bailiff approached to escort her back to custody, didn't look toward the gallery where her victims were seated, didn't acknowledge the weight of what she had done or the justice that was finally being served. I watched, my twin sister being led away in handcuffs, and felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and finality. The criminal case was over, but the consequences would continue for years. Rachel would spend the next decade in federal prison while her victims would spend much longer trying to rebuild what she had destroyed. Outside the courthouse, Agent Martinez thanked me for my cooperation with the investigation and assured me that federal agents would continue working to recover additional assets that could benefit victims. She explained that civil litigation would likely continue for years, but that Rachel's conviction would make those cases much easier to resolve in victims' favor. Patricia walked with me to the parking garage, discussing the next steps in defending against the remaining lawsuits. Several more businesses had dropped their claims after Rachel's conviction, but 3 cases were still pending. She was optimistic that these would be dismissed or settled favorably now that there was a criminal conviction establishing that I had been victimized rather than complicit in the underlying fraud. The media attention following Rachel's sentencing was intense but generally sympathetic to my situation. News reports focused on the sophisticated nature of the identity theft ring and the innovative techniques that criminals were using to steal identities and defraud businesses. Several reporters interviewed me about warning signs that people should watch for and steps they could take to protect themselves from similar crimes. Those interviews led to speaking opportunities at business conferences and law enforcement seminars, where I shared my experience and the lessons I'd learned about identity protection. The presentations were emotionally difficult, but they also provided a sense of purpose that helped me begin healing from the trauma Rachel had inflicted. 6 months after Rachel's sentencing, I made the decision to refocus my consulting business on helping other identity theft victims navigate the complex legal and financial challenges they faced. My personal experience with both criminal and civil aspects of identity theft gave me unique insights that were valuable to people dealing with similar situations. The transition wasn't easy. Many potential clients were initially skeptical about working with someone whose identity had been stolen so extensively, questioning whether I had been competent enough to protect myself. But those concerns usually disappeared once people understood the sophisticated nature of Rachel's crimes and the extensive federal investigation that had been required to uncover the full scope of her activities. Working with other identity theft victims was both rewarding and heartbreaking. I met people whose lives had been destroyed by criminals who showed the same callous indifference that Rachel had demonstrated. But I also saw the resilience and determination that allowed victims to rebuild their lives and find meaning in their survival. One of my first clients was David Chen, the consultant whose testimony had been so powerful at Rachel's sentencing. David's situation was more complex than mine because he hadn't discovered the identity theft until much later, making it harder to prove his innocence and recover his losses. But we were able to work together to clear his credit, restore his professional reputation, and establish new security measures that protected him from future crimes. Another client was a woman whose identity had been stolen by her own daughter, creating family dynamics that were painfully familiar. The betrayal by someone who should have been trustworthy was devastating, but it was also something I understood intimately. Being able to help her navigate both the legal challenges and the emotional trauma was deeply meaningful work. As my new business grew, I also became involved in advocacy efforts to strengthen identity theft laws and improve support services for victims. I testified before state and federal legislative committees about the gaps in current protections and the additional resources that victims needed to recover from sophisticated crimes. The advocacy work brought me into contact with law enforcement agencies, consumer protection organizations, and other experts working to combat identity theft. I learned about emerging threats and new protective technologies, information that I could share with clients and audiences at speaking engagements. 2 years after Rachel's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. The letter was brief and carefully worded, probably reviewed by her attorney before being sent. She wrote that she had been thinking about the impact of her actions and wanted to express remorse for the damage she had caused to my life and the lives of her other victims. Rachel claimed that she was participating in counseling programs and educational courses that were helping her understand the psychological factors that had contributed to her criminal behavior. She wrote about taking responsibility for her choices and working to become a better person during her incarceration. The letter felt like another attempt at manipulation, but it also suggested that Rachel might be genuinely grappling with the consequences of her actions. I chose not to respond, maintaining the emotional distance I needed to continue healing from her betrayal. The final civil lawsuit against me was dismissed 3 years after Rachel's arrest, bringing legal closure to the case that had dominated my life for so long. Mitchell's custom cabinetry had recovered some of their losses through the federal restitution process, and Robert Mitchell sent me a letter expressing gratitude for my cooperation with the investigation that had brought Rachel to justice. By that time, my identity theft consulting business was thriving, and I had become a recognized expert in the field. I regularly spoke at conferences, wrote articles for professional publications, and consulted with law enforcement agencies on complex cases. The nightmare that Rachel had created had been transformed into a career that provided meaning and purpose. I still lived in the same apartment building where Rachel had conducted her surveillance and planned her crimes. The space no longer felt violated or unsafe. Instead, it had become a symbol of my resilience and my refusal to let her actions define my life. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had discovered Rachel's crimes earlier, whether intervention might have prevented some of the damage she caused. But I had learned that second-guessing decisions made with incomplete information was a form of self-torture that served no constructive purpose. Rachel's crimes had taught me that trust was precious and fragile, that even the closest relationships could harbor devastating betrayals. But they had also taught me that survival was possible, that identity could be reclaimed, and that traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and purpose. The woman who had tried to erase me completely was serving a federal prison sentence, while I had built a new life that was more meaningful than anything I had imagined before her crimes were discovered. Justice had been served, victims had been compensated, and I had found a way to use my experience to help others facing similar challenges. 4 years after that terrifying morning when I watched myself get arrested on television, I had reclaimed not just my identity but my sense of purpose and direction. Rachel's attempt to steal my life had ultimately led me to discover who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. The scars would always remain, but they had become part of a story of survival and transformation rather than victimization and loss. My name was my own again, my reputation was rebuilt, and my future was filled with possibilities that Rachel's crimes could never take away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.